On New Year's Day in 1966, television viewers had a choice to make. On NBC was the Rose Bowl football game, but those who changed the channel to ABC saw a delayed airing of the NASCAR Sportsman race in Charlotte.
And today we're looking forward to what should be an exciting race. Now, just in case you're not familiar with what a modified sportsman's race is, this is a race that allows the mechanics, the owners, for a little more experimentation with their cars. It also lets the little guy into the field. So you're going to hear some names today that perhaps you haven't heard before in stock car racing.
An interesting thing here is that we have a new leader, Ralph Earnhardt in car number 50 in the lead, and Bobby Allison is in second in 05. Neither of those cars pitted now. Coming into the pits right now, Ralph Earnhardt in car number 50. Remember, he hadn't pitted earlier, and this is the first pit stop for him. He had the lead at one point, I think, for about a lap and a half there before he was finally forced back to second by Bobby Allison. And here's the checkered flag for Leroy Yarbrough. Flashing across, and the winner of the Modified Sportsman's 250 here at the Charlotte Motor Speedway. Ralph Earnhardt will take the checkered flag for second. We've been informed that there has been a protest that has been lodged against Leroy Yarbrough. So let's go down to Chris Economaki and get the story.
Ralph, it looks as though they found something wrong with Yarbrough's car. Is that right?
Well, they found an illegal wheel on it.
And this would make you the winner if this protest is allowed, huh?
Well, I guess it do. We all knew about it.
Is that right?
Yeah, we was all told before the race.
Well, how do you feel about winning one this way, Ralph?
Well, I'd rather outrun him, but we wasn't allowed the wheels, and being he was running the wheels, he was illegal, I guess.
Well, a possible winner is Ralph Earnhardt. Now, back to you, Bill Fleming.
Right, Chris, and not only possible, but it is official now. Earnhardt has won, and Leroy Yarbrough has been disqualified.
People across the country saw something those in the Carolinas knew for 15 years. Ralph Earnhardt was a winner. But unfortunately, that day was the only time national audiences got to see it. When modern racing fans hear Ralph Earnhardt's name, his legacy is the patriarch of a family dynasty, but his personal accomplishments are overshadowed. A victim of competing in an era when records were not well kept, and a NASCAR series that no longer exist. Ralph Earnhardt won over 350 NASCAR races, believed he had 2 cup wins erased by scoring errors, and was so good at one track that he was banned to protect the competition. As a driver, Ralph was smart and took care of his equipment, running hard when he really had to. He won countless races by last lap passes. With his motto of "go or blow" painted on many of his early cars, Ralph was selectively aggressive, with a familiar charm that could earn forgiveness after a run-in.
And Ralph and I became good friends, but there were times when we would have some run-ins on the racetrack, but you couldn't stay mad at him. He was the type of a guy, he'd come up to you, even if he hit you and knocked you off the track, put his arm around you and say, "Ned, I didn't mean to hit you that hard going into that turn," and you just couldn't help but like him. And I'm certainly glad that I got to race against him.
Besides being a great driver, Earnhardt was one of the best mechanics in stock car racing, saying in a 1959 interview, quote, "I believe my reputation as a builder of racing engines equals my reputation as a driver." In 1958, it was reported that 5 of his 15 competitors at Columbia were using engines built by Ralph. He spoke with pride on nights when a chassis he built finished behind him. One night at Metrolina in 1969, he won the Sportsman feature and pointed out that the car that finished second used an engine and chassis that he built. That same night, the winner of the semi-modified division was using a chassis and engine he built, and the second-place car used one of Ralph's chassis. And the winner of the hobby division was also using an Earnhardt-built chassis. Earnhardt would unload his cars at the track and never have to work on them in the pits. His meticulous preparation during the week meant he was ready to race once he showed up. He once said, quote, "Some of these fellows today think they can wait until they get to the track before they put these finishing touches on a car. They are the tinkerers, and tinkerers don't win. How many times have you seen me mess with a car once I get it to the track? Not once. Maybe a touch or two here, but I never have to work under the hood. If it's not right when it gets here, nothing they can do in the pits will do a damn bit of good. You've got to come ready to run." Like other racers of his time, Ralph was very superstitious. He thought it was bad luck to have his picture taken before a race. Driving to the track one day, he noticed a crewman in his truck wearing green socks. Ralph made him throw the socks out the window. In 1961, he raced in the same pair of tan pants to bring him luck, and peanuts were never allowed near the race car.
Yeah, so Ralph believed in those superstitions of green was bad luck.
No peanuts.
No peanuts. The story is, you can tell me whether it's true or not, that he pulled a gun on somebody that was around his car with peanuts.
I'm not sure about
Kathy's
that.
over there shaking her head yes.
What? That seems
She
like an
probably remembers that
overreaction.
more than I do.
Ralph was a slim 6 foot tall with a scar on his left cheek that he got at 18 months old in a car crash. He was called the Kannapolis Cannonball. Others called him Ironheart, a determined man from an era and region where hard work could help him break free from the hard lives of his neighbors. Kannapolis, North Carolina was known as Towel City in the 1940s, home of Cannon Mills, the world's largest producer of towels and sheets. While most people in town worked at the cotton mill, the 1950 census lists Ralph as a mechanic at a service station. It was there that his pathway to racing began. Someone asked him to build an engine for a race car. When it was finished, the owner invited Ralph to drive the car in a race. Ralph married his wife Martha in 1947 before he started racing. The local Kannapolis newspaper reported as he and 2 others drove down to Daytona Beach in January 1949 to watch the NASCAR modified race.
When Ralph first approached me about driving a race car, I thought he had gone crazy. Our oldest daughter, Kay, was about 5 months old, and Ralph promised me that if he couldn't make a living or do it without taking away from the family, that he would not pursue it any further. But from the time he started, he kept me and 5 children up without me ever having to work outside of the family.
It was around 1949 that Ralph began racing. He first competed in a series called the Fast Oval Race Drivers Club, or the Ford Club for short, running Ford coupes on local dirt tracks like North Wilkesboro and Hickory. There, one of his biggest rivals was a 21-year-old moonshiner named Junior Johnson. Ralph described himself as a wild kid in those early years, saying, quote, "I guess I wanted to be a show-off at the start. I remember a race at Hickory in 1953. I won it. When they gave me the checkered flag, I was so determined to show the fans I was a red-hot driver that I turned my car over on the extra lap." At the start of his career, Ralph credited his biggest influence to Red Vogt, one of the founding fathers of NASCAR. It was Red who suggested the name NASCAR at its creation in 1947, and who built the cars driven by NASCAR's first champion, Red Byron. Vogt helped Ralph get a good engine and gave advice. Earnhardt began winning races in 1952, taking the May 4th race at North Wilkesboro, there again on July 20th. It was in 1953 that he began dominating tracks like Hickory and the Ford Club Tour. While NASCAR staged a Sportsman Championship race at Raleigh on September 19th, Earnhardt spent the day winning 2 races, first at Rutherford County Speedway in the afternoon, then driving over to Hickory and winning that night. Earnhardt won the Hickory Track Championship and the season title for the Ford Club. 1954 was the first year Ralph competed solely in NASCAR, running in the Sportsman division. While it would later evolve into the current Xfinity Series, the Sportsman division in its early form was similar to the current Weekly Series. There, dozens of tracks are NASCAR sanctioned, with state championships and an overall national champion. That meant, on a given Saturday night, there could be a dozen tracks paying Sportsman points. There would also be a handful of national events that paid higher points. The Sportsman division was the classic 1930s cars with stock flathead engines, different from the modified division, which allowed engines with overhead valves and more carburetors. In 1954, Ralph again took the Hickory Track Championship, finished 5th in the North Carolina State Sportsman standings and 36th in the national standings. 1955 was even better for Ralph, as he now committed himself to racing full-time. He won even more races, finished 2nd in the national standings behind Billy Myers. 1956 was the year where everything fell into place for Earnhardt. Billy Myers moved to the Cup Series. Ralph had the driving experience, and his cars were perfect, but he faced a strong challenge from a 23-year-old Ned Jarrett.
I had the good fortune of racing against Ralph Earnhardt for many years on the short tracks around the Carolinas and the southeastern part of the country. We would race many times, 4 or 5 times a week. His cars were always prepared to the absolute best. You couldn't catch him on an off night because he didn't have those. He was always up near the front. So if you beat him, you had to be the best that night yourself.
Earnhardt won track championships at the Charlotte Fairgrounds at Hickory. In 76 races he entered that year, he won 34. Earnhardt won the 1956 Sportsman National Championship by a strong margin over Jarrett. After winning the title, Ralph earned a chance to drive in the Cup Series, then known as the Grand National Division. It was an unusual scenario, where the 1957 season began on November 11th, while the 1956 season was technically still ongoing, due to rescheduled races being pushed to the end of the year. That meant on the same day, a race at Hickory was held that counted toward the 1956 points, while a race at Willow Springs Road Course in California counted towards 1957. Fireball Roberts was committed to running the race in Willow Springs, while his ride with the Ford factory team needed a driver in Hickory. Hired to take his place was the local track champion, Ralph Earnhardt. In his Grand National debut, Ralph was the fastest qualifier, but to win he would have to beat Speedy Thompson, who had the fastest car in the race and led most of the event. Running second, Earnhardt pitted with 13 laps to go, giving Thompson a lap lead. Thompson ran out of fuel and pitted with 5 laps to go, putting Earnhardt back onto the lead lap, 5 seconds behind the lead. With 1 lap to go, the flagman thought Earnhardt was leading and gave him the white flag. The head scorer quickly informed him that Thompson was leading, and Speedy was given the checkered flag. The track speakers announced that Earnhardt had won before correcting, saying that Thompson was the winner. Feeling that the local driver was robbed, the crowd erupted into a near riot, throwing soda bottles onto the track. Earnhardt was called to the microphone to tell the crowd he was satisfied with the scoring explanation and knew that he had finished second. Combining the Sportsman Championship with his great run at Hickory, Ralph became one of the most desired drivers for Grand National teams. Ford was so impressed they offered him a spot on their team for 1957, but it was reported that Ralph was uninterested in going Grand National racing. He would need to be away from home more often and made good money in sportsman racing, and so he turned the offer down. Years later, Ralph said, quote, "You're somewhat of a captive to Grand National racing. I mean, you're away from home much of the time and the expenses are so much greater. I guess I'm pretty much of a homebody. I enjoy being with my family." Despite his resistance to move up, Ralph was drawn into the Cup Series that spring. He was hired as a mid-season replacement on the Lee Petty-owned team when Tiny Lund left. Driving an Oldsmobile, he ran 8 races, finishing in the top 10 3 times. Then it was back to the sportsman cars. While Ralph spent several months in Grand National, Ned Jarrett stepped in to win the 1957 Sportsman Championship. 1958 was a duel for the championship between Earnhardt and Jarrett. It was also the year that a rivalry with Banjo Matthews reached its peak. The most explosive moment came at the quarter-mile McCormick Field Baseball Stadium track in Asheville, North Carolina on May 31st. In a heat race at the unique track, Matthews bumped Earnhardt and sent him crashing into the first base dugout wall. Ralph continued ahead of Banjo and pulled to the inside of the track, exiting left field. As Banjo moved to the outside to pass, Ralph turned to the right and squeezed him into the wall. Ralph then pulled into the infield around third base and stopped, pointing towards the track, seemingly waiting for Banjo to arrive. Banjo hit the gas and headed straight for him, slamming into Ralph's right side. The men were restrained from fighting, and Banjo was fined $50 and suspended for the night. That year, Earnhardt served as a teammate and mentor to Bobby Isaac, a future champion himself. In a 1960 interview, Ralph said, quote, "The only driver who gives me a hard time is Bobby Isaac, but I think that comes from the fact that we get a big kick out of beating each other. As far as I'm concerned, Bobby Isaac is one of the best friends I've got in this racing business." On August 1st, Ralph was in a race at Spartanburg, South Carolina, when he suffered a violent crash. He hit another car and slid off the track, impacting a 2x6 piece of wood which pierced through the radiator, knocked the exhaust manifold off the engine, and went through the floorboards, breaking bones in his right foot. It was expected that the injuries would keep him out several weeks, which led to this famous picture of Ralph in the trunk of his Oldsmobile talking to Bobby Isaac, Richard Petty, and Ned Jarrett. But after reevaluating the injury, the x-ray showed it wasn't as bad as originally thought, and his cast came off. As car owner Frank Presley explained, quote, "He's got to drive with a wife and 5 kids at home to feed." And impressively, just 8 days after his injury, Earnhardt won a 400-lap race in McCormick Field. Once again, Ralph finished second in the National Sportsman standings behind Ned Jarrett, won the track championships at Greensboro, Columbia, and McCormick Field. In 1959, NASCAR created a new series, the Limited Sportsman Division. It was a spin-off of the Sportsman series where engine sizes were limited to flatheads and Fords, V6s, and everything else. While the series would last only 5 years, Ralph committed to the new tour. Standing in the way of the title was a new challenger from South Carolina, who seemingly came out of nowhere, 25-year-old David Pearson. 1959 saw many close battles between Earnhardt and Pearson, but it was Earnhardt winning the Limited Sportsman Championship with a reported 60 wins. One of the highlights of the season came at Bowman Gray on May 2nd. In a combination race for modified and sportsman cars, Ralph's sportsman car was at a disadvantage to the more powerful modifieds. Regardless, Ralph won the race, beating Glenn Wood to the embarrassment of those with bigger engines. I don't think they will ever forgive me for that, but I must say it was one of the biggest thrills of my racing career. By this point, Earnhardt was a divisive figure for fans, a dominant racer who needed to win and didn't mind if people booed him. The difference between first and second place in the limited sportsman races is usually $40. That $40 will buy a lot of groceries. If you get in this racket for a living, you've got to win. It may get boring to some people that I win all of the time. It doesn't bore me one little bit. I've got to win. After expenses, Ralph estimated he made $9,000 in 1959. That was about 60% higher than the average income in the United States of $5,600. But if Ralph was going to make a living by winning, he had one less track to race at. After nearly a decade of wins and 5 track championships, Hickory banned Ralph from competing there. Hickory results in 1959 are hard to find, but by August it was reported that Ralph had won 20 of 21 races there. Earnhardt's domination presented a danger to the track's existence as fans stayed away, knowing the outcome was almost a guaranteed Earnhardt win. As Ralph explained in 1964, "They won't let me run there anymore. They say I monopolized it then, and I'd monopolize it again." 1960 started poorly for Earnhardt. Because of his championship in '59, he was invited to compete in the sportsman race at Daytona. There, Ralph was involved in the largest crash in NASCAR history and flipped in turn 4, but walked away unhurt.
The most fantastic pileup in auto racing history takes 37 cars out of the race.
On April 20th, Ralph and Martha were coming home from a race when a cow walked onto the highway. Ralph hit the cow and slid off the road into a ditch, the race car flipping off the trailer. But the year would only get better from there, starting with a win at Columbia the day after the cow incident. Earnhardt would solidify his reputation as king of the sportsman drivers. Over the summer, he won 9 straight races between July 12th and August 1st. He had won 12 of 14 races at the Columbia Speedway. This led the track to bring in Joe Weatherly to stop him. The outspoken Weatherly did promos, saying that he was the man to stop Ralph. Earnhardt's a junior Lee Petty. Both of those guys need to be taken down every now and then, he said. Earnhardt had better be running pretty good. I've heard he's pretty tough in the turns at the Columbia Speedway. Well, I'm a pro too. We'll see how he can run against a real race driver. In a climax on August 4th, Earnhardt and Weatherly knocked each other out of the race with a fender-banging duel for the lead. Still, the two were good friends, with the Virginian saying, quote, "That Earnhardt is good. He's plenty tough. I wish he'd run in some of the big car races." By 1960, that was a common question. Why didn't Ralph Earnhardt race in Grand National? Beyond not wanting to be away from his family, Ralph liked owning his own cars. In a 1960 interview, he explained, quote, "I own my own cars, do all the work on them, and don't have to split it with anybody. Some race drivers figure the ideal situation is to let another person own the cars and take 40 to 60% of the winnings. I don't agree with them. I'd rather have my own cars, do all the work, and keep all of the prize money. 25 years later, Dale Earnhardt agreed this was the main reason his father never became a Grand National superstar. Daddy was honest, quiet, and independent, he said. I think it was his independence that maybe was the reason he didn't go much further in racing. Ralph also said the Grand National cars were too expensive. The price of a car was around $9,000, 3 times as much as a sportsman car. Racing 3 times a week was profitable as opposed to investing more money into a series that wouldn't make money unless you were a top team. He also made good money building engines and carburetors for other sportsman drivers. Earnhardt repeated as NASCAR's limited sportsman champion and won over 50 races in 1960, but at the end of the year it was reported that he was open to running some Grand National races. In 1961, he went down to Daytona for the 500 without a ride and ended up being at the right place at the right time. On race morning, Cotton Owens finished working on his car at 5:30 a.m. and then tried to race a few hours later. After 200 miles, he was so exhausted he needed a relief driver. As Ralph explained later that year, quote, Owens came into the pits and asked for a relief driver. He spotted me and said to get in. In the days before fire suits, Ralph got in the car in his street clothes, put on Cotton's helmet, and entered the race with no experience driving a Grand National car at Daytona. Earnhardt impressively finished 5th, 2 laps behind race winner Marvin Panch. Performance was so good that it led to a deal to run more big races for Owens, who wanted to transition from driver to owner. Earnhardt would take the super speedways, and Owens would keep racing the short tracks. Despite his allegiance to sportsman racing, Ralph admitted, I had hopes that someday I would find the right car and right backer to enter Grand National racing. When he was asked years later, Ralph said that his last goal in racing was to win a Grand National race, but according to him, he accomplished that in 1961. Twice. I have one, but they didn't give it to me, he said. The first disputed race came at Atlanta in March, his first race for Owens. Ralph won a 10-lap qualifying race a day before challenging for the win in the Atlanta 500. When the checkered flag waved, Earnhardt initially finished second, but later dropped to third. Still, he maintained he was a lap ahead of the winner, and a scoring error was to blame. I thought I won. Cotton said I won. Even the scorers said I won, he said, but I didn't get the money. According to the final tabulation, Bob Burdick finished first. I guess he just can't beat an educated pencil. Earnhardt returned at Darlington in early May. He led 6 laps, but finished 3 laps behind the leaders. Again, he thought the scoring may have cost him a win, saying, quote, in the Rebel 300, I was leading, and I made a fast pit stop. Well, nobody passed me, and I finished 8th. We still haven't figured that one out. Ralph's third race was the World 600. He finished second in a qualifying race, then led 75 laps early in the main event.
And right behind, 2 more Pontiacs coming hard in 3rd and 4th place. Veteran Marvin Panch and newcomer Ralph Earnhardt. These boys don't intend to be left out of the action either. Now Earnhardt challenges Pearson and blasts into the lead. Earnhardt gives up first place as mechanics give his car the once-over. Tires must be replaced already.
Running 4th after 500 miles, several stops near the end for blistered tires dropped him to 11th as his sportsman rival David Pearson earned his first career win.
Cotton Owens. He set the lap record here last year as a driver. Now he handles the wrenches and plans the strategy for his driver, Ralph Earnhardt. His Pontiac, number 6.
Earnhardt drove 3 more races in the number 6 car, never finishing worse than 11th, but never any better than 9th. After the Southern 500, Ralph was moved to the second Owens car for Atlanta. Then at Charlotte in October, Owens returned to the cockpit himself and left Earnhardt without a ride. At the time, Cotton said he had been battling the flu all year and finally felt well enough to run a long race. but other reports said the split was due to strained relations between Cotton and Ralph. In his races for Owens, Earnhardt made a good impression with people at Pontiac who helped him get a ride in a year-old car for the 1962 season. In 17 Grand National races, Ralph had a pair of top 5 finishes at Concord and Hickory, while also winning a handful of sportsman races.
That Pontiac qualified at 127 miles an hour, and Ralph Earnhardt proves that it can run almost as fast backwards. The yellow caution signal slows traffic. Earnhardt's not hurt. If that car will still run, he'll make it back to the pits and out of the race.
(1963) began as Ralph finished second in a 20-lap consolation race for the Daytona 500, but had a bad fuel pump knock him out only 15 laps into the main event. He again ran 11 races during the 1964 season, with one top 5 finish being a 4th at Hillsborough. His last attempt at running a cup race came when he failed to qualify for the 1966 World 600. Instead of trying to compete in an uncompetitive car, he returned to sportsman racing.
So here is Ralph Earnhardt unlapping himself. So there you have the second place car ahead of the first place car in a unique placement. A lap and a half to go now for Leroy Yarbrough of Columbia, South Carolina, and he'll have this 250 race all wrapped up. Ralph Earnhardt is in second place, but he's a lap behind, so when the white flag comes out for Leroy Yarbrough, he's pretty well got it made today, Roger. And here's the checkered flag for Leroy Yarbrough, flashing across, and the winner of the Modified Sportsman's 250 here at the Charlotte Motor Speedway. Right, Chris, and not only possible, but it is official now. Earnhardt has won, and Leroy Yarbrough has been disqualified.
Arguably, Ralph had his crowning moment in a nationally televised race at Charlotte in October 1965. After finishing second, Ralph inherited the win when Leroy Yarbrough was disqualified. By the mid-60s, the national sportsman standings were dominated by New England drivers. Earnhardt never repeated his sportsman championship, but had several more top 5 finishes. 1969 was a year of change for Ralph, as he left NASCAR competition and ran at unsanctioned tracks. At 41 years old, driving 250-mile round trips to and from Columbia and Greenville Pickens was tiring. Earnhardt explained, quote, "Getting home from a race at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, only to have to get ready for another race that night, was getting rough." Fortunately, local tracks like Concord and Metrolina raced every week, and they were less than 30 minutes from his house. Ralph began racing in a small series called Gas Car, named after the owner of the series, John Gasky. Friday night at Metrolina, Saturday night at Concord. For the next 4 years, Earnhardt dominated both tracks, winning both track championships 4 years in a row. "I really love this business of racing only on Friday and Saturday nights and getting home early both times," he said. "Financially, I'm doing as well as I did in the year I won the national championship." In early March 1973, it was reported that Ralph had been hospitalized. Heart problems were slowing the man known as Ironheart. He was put on blood thinners and was given a special diet. Ralph returned to racing on April 20th, where he won a heat race at Metrolina. Focusing on his health, he stepped out of the car to put Stick Elliott behind the wheel. Elliott dominated while driving Earnhardt's car. Ralph returned to racing in June and took 2 consecutive wins at Concord, and his 22-year-old son Dale joined him most nights, competing in the semi-modified division. On Wednesday, September 26th, Ralph suffered a heart attack at his home and died at the age of 45. One of the greatest racers NASCAR had ever seen was gone. Ralph's obituary mentioned Dale and how Ralph thought he would make a good Cup Series driver someday. Years later, Dale thought the effort his father put into building cars and racing them led to his father's passing. He had worked so hard, he said. I think the racing, all the hard work and the worry, caused the strain and the heart attack. Ralph was an icon of a fading era, and his passing was symbolic. By the early 70s, many people remarked at the seeming death of dirt track racing. NASCAR dropped dirt from their schedules. The future was on asphalt. Ralph knew it, and encouraged Dale to focus on paved tracks. Shortly before his death, Ralph told his son, quote, "If you ever expect to go anywhere in racing, you will have to join NASCAR and learn to drive asphalt."
Now there's the kid to watch. This kid Earnhardt, second-generation driver. His father, the most famous short-track drivers in American racing history, well-known Ralph Earnhardt. His kid looks good today.
7 years later, Dale had done just that, fulfilling the promise that Ralph saw and winning the Cup championship in 1980. But to do so, Dale had to give up the family life that Ralph refused to do. With 2 divorces, Dale was remorseful on how his family life differed from his father's. Shortly after winning the championship, Dale said, quote, "My daddy did right by his family, raised the kids, sent them to school. They came first with him. Nothing gets me down for long, but I miss the security of having a wife and kids with me. I'm gone so often and so long, it would make it rough on them, but there is no substitute for them."
I think what really changed my life is getting my kids under my roof from a previous marriage, and they came to live with me. I had custody of them. In 1982, marrying Teresa. I think that really turned it around.
Ralph died before he could share in his son's successes, and despite the glory of racing triumphs, his father's death still haunts him.
When you have problems, Jackie, you think back at something Ralph Earnhardt would have did, or what would he do in this situation, or what would he have done? And it really helps me. I missed him more because of accomplishments I made, and I just wished he could be here to be able to do things I do now. Not just the racing, but the deer hunting and things that we do now that he really enjoyed doing. You know, I miss him more now than I did when he first died. I stayed mad for about a year after he died. It made me mad. It hurt, but I was mad about it, you know. It took a while to get over that.
As Dale won championships, Ralph's memory was kept alive, inducted in many Hall of Fames.
And congratulations, too, to the new inductees into the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame. Jerry Cook was inducted, along with Ralph Earnhardt, the late model sportsman, stock car legend.
Really made the family happy and all the people and fans that he had years ago, and to be remembered, you know, so it's a pretty neat deal.
The only thing that I'd change and went back in life is, I wish my dad was here to see it all, but you can't change things like that, so.
Yeah, but you know, one side of it, they'll just, you know, he accomplished a lot in racing, and now with the stuff you're doing, I think it really, people look a little deeper and see what he did and realize, you know, how successful he was.
That's true.
It brought a lot of light back on what your dad did accomplish.
Well, on behalf of my brothers and my sisters, I'm proud to introduce the next inductee to the International Motorsports Hall of Fame, our dad, Ralph Earnhardt.
In 1998, Ralph was named one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers, and again one of the 75 greatest drivers in 2023. But can we quantify just how great he truly was? At the time of his death, Bobby Isaacs said, quote, "If they kept records of it, Ralph Earnhardt has probably won more races than any other driver in the country." He won so many races that it's hard to even know the exact number. His wins came in a time when sportsman results were not well reported. Even now, there are gaps in newspaper archives where not every win is accounted for. Sometimes a win wasn't reported in a newspaper, or if it was, the newspaper hasn't been digitized. Earnhardt began competing full-time in NASCAR in 1954 and left after 1968. In that time, we found 209 confirmed NASCAR race wins. That's only a portion of his true victories. In his 1956 championship year, it was reported he won 34 races. We could only find 18. In 1959, it was said he won over 60, while we could only find 35. The International Motorsports Hall of Fame says he won over 350 NASCAR races, and if we could only find about 2/3 of his wins, that figure should be reasonable. Take into account his wins before NASCAR and his wins in the early 70s, and Ralph's total victory list could reach 500 wins. For the era of sportsman racing in the first 2 decades of NASCAR, there was no one more dominant than Ralph Earnhardt. While his family gets recognition for their achievements, those familiar with Ralph know he was every bit as significant to NASCAR in his time.